Greetings, old school magic players, and welcome to the Four Horsemen. My name is Brian Weissman. I'm here with my good friend Chad. What's coming up is both format introduction, a deck tech, and finally some matches recently played in the 17th tournament of Old School Four Horsemen. This format is really interesting, actually. I was introduced to it right at its inception. I think it had only hosted a couple of events roughly 2 years ago. And I was intrigued by the format because unlike regular Old School, which feels quite solved, whether it's Atlantic or Eternal Central or any one of the other variants, Four Horsemen decided to see what it was like in Old School if two incredibly critical sets were removed. Fallen Empires from late 1994 and Alpha, and all cards from Alpha, anything in Beta, anything in Unlimited, anything in Revised. Any card that had been released in Alpha was banned from the format. So minus that core set, what was Old School like? Well, Chad and his co-designers decided to go and find out what that looked like. They founded this format. It's been evolving ever since, and quite recently, it concluded tournament number 17. If you can believe it, they've held 17 full events, and an 18th one is coming up relatively soon if you want to jump on board that format yourself. You can find the Facebook group by just simply searching for Four Horsemen. They're a really, really cool community. Apparently, the format has really taken off in Australia also, where the Old School community has embraced it. And I would now say unequivocally that Four Horsemen can count itself right alongside the other really established Old School formats, including 7-Point Singleton, X-Point Singleton, and all the different regular Old School variants. So when Chad invited me to do the commentary for this event, I was really thrilled to do that. I've been kind of watching it from afar as it's continued to evolve. And in fact, the restricted and banned list has evolved a ton since the format's inception. When the format began, you weren't even allowed to play with dual lands. And I actually made a recommendation pretty early on that adding dual lands to the format would increase deck diversity a lot. And it just seemed too punitive and too restrictive of people's creativity to make people play with only either basic lands or cities of brass in order to play their mana base. So you are allowed to play with one thing technically from Alpha, which is the dual lands. But I think the format really benefits from that. And if you really want to screw with it and tamp down on them, you can just run Blood Moon anyway. Chad invited me to this tournament in particular because he had made the finals, which I believe, unless he corrects me, was the first time he had made it all the way to the finals. Is that true, Chad?
That's right. Yeah, it's tough to do that in this format these days. The players have gotten really good.
Yeah, players have gotten really good, and the card pool is relatively small. It's smaller than Old School, so deck diversity is lower right now, but it has an extremely malleable, a very agile, restricted and banned list that continues to evolve. And in fact, Tournament 18 will contain a totally different restricted and banned list from Tournament 17. And in fact, you'll kind of see why in these games coming up. I wanted to thank Chad for inviting me to do the commentary. If you are a fan of Old School formats, I think you'll find this to be a bit of a breath of fresh air. If you want to refer back to a video I produced on my channel a couple of years ago, which was my first real foray into the tournament, you can see the difference now between the restricted and banned lists reflected in the deck that I played back then versus what is currently restricted and banned now. And the two decks are really, really interesting that are coming up. They are both fundamentally red-green, but they are both a kind of mixture of opposite strategies. One effectively a red-green combo deck, and the other one a red-green control deck. So without further ado, I am going to jump straight into the deck tech, which I completed with John Ekleberry, who is, alongside Chad, has been one of the primary people curating and continuing to update this really exciting and interesting format. Enjoy the games, enjoy the deck tech, guys, and I will see you next time. What's up, guys? Welcome back to some more Four Horsemen Old School action. I am Brian Weissman. I am joined today by John Ekleberry, and I am setting my feet back into a format that I was playing in, I feel like a year and a half ago, actually, when it was still in its infancy. And since I last played in this format, I think there's been more than a dozen tournaments. The format has continued to evolve, and we have the finals of, again, tournament number 17, a contest between one of the format's founders, Chad, and his opponent, Peter Soltes, who has been a tenacious finalist across many, many events. John, how many times has Peter been in the finals?
This will be his 10th.
It seems like he's been able to weather the storm as the format has continued to evolve. And it seems like he's played thematically different iterations of the same basic strategy, right? It seems like he's been on essentially red-green with a splash for quite some time. Further ado, let's jump right into the deck list and let's take a look, first of all, at what Chad has been playing on his way to the finals. Looking at Chad's deck list here, he has described it as Living Plane, Falling Star, Take 2. And Chad had some success with this archetype relatively early on in his experience with Four Horsemen. Of course, this set is missing Alpha and Fallen Empires when it comes to the traditional old school format. So you're forced to kind of you're forced to innovate and use cards that you normally don't see a great deal of play. And in fact, one of those cards in particular jumps out at me as being a powerhouse, not only in the format, but particularly showcased in the finals. That card, peeking there in Chad's deck list behind Sylvan Library, is the Mighty Falling Star. John, can you describe to me a little bit about Falling Star's impact in this format and why it's so good?
We have adapted the Swedish rules for it, so you get to have a fair flip. You can reorganize your opponent's board on your side as you see fit. So essentially, you're able to hit 6 cards if you get a good flip. You do have to have the dexterity skill to be able to do it, I suppose. We've known the card's powerful for a while, but it's funny, it hasn't really shown up in the format the way that we thought it would until a lot more recently.
When you flip the Falling Star, for those who are not familiar with it, it has to flip over at least once, turn over at least once, and it needs to flip like a coin, which means that it's rotating 360 degrees across, I guess, the x-axis of the card. And when you mentioned that it can hit up to 6 permanents, you can effectively imagine in a hypothetical situation, your opponent has 6 creatures in play. You could lay them out side by side in a perfect grid with no overlap. And if you had perfect dexterity, you could land the Falling Star to clip all 6 permanents. So even if you don't kill them outright by dealing 3 damage to them, it also taps them. So you get this crazy tap your opponent out and swing for lethal effect, in addition to having spot removal if you need it to do that. Flexibility is pretty unparalleled in the format. And of course, you can do other cool things with it also. Like, for example, you can use it on your own Rook Eggs, which is another card that I see in a lot of these deck lists. Tell me a little bit about Rook Egg's appearance in the format, because I don't remember it having a huge impact when I was playing the format. Has it been something that you've seen in lots of the deck lists?
It has really grown over the format. I mean, in those first 3 or 4 tournaments, blue was really predominant because we had a lot less of a restricted list. Blue Robots was, a huge deck because those cards are just the best cards in the format. But once we pulled back from that, we started to see the rise of Rook Egg. A 4/4 flyer is pretty good in this environment.
Yeah, no joke. And if you notice, particularly in Chad's deck here, and I imagine any deck that's running Rook Egg, you have a lot of natural ways to hatch your own rooks. So the card is really, really difficult to deal with. You don't really want to attack into it. You don't really want to counter it. You certainly don't want to destroy it. And there aren't really any ways that I know of to exile it easily. So you can just play these Rook Eggs, and then gradually just Chain Lightning creates a 4/4, or a Triskelion creates a 4/4 at instant speed. Even Falling Star could hatch 2 of them and start smashing for 8. And it's a really interesting example of a card that you would never ever see played in traditional old school, because there's so many things that just contain it and constrain it. There's tons of good flyers. There's Swords to Plowshares, which exile the Rook Egg and prevent it from actually hatching a flyer. And in this format, it seems like a genuine powerhouse, and that you can almost deterministically get the 4/4s online.
Yes.
I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other cards in Chad's deck. I'm going to just move through the spells real quick, as we do essentially a deck tech. Chad's running 4 copies of Chain Lightning, which is just the best removal spell in the format in terms of mana efficiency. It's only sorcery speed, but it does have that added ability of allowing you to potentially Chain Lightning your own Rook Egg, and then if you've got 3 red mana total, you can redirect the bolt onto something else. Do you see Chain Lightning appearing in so many deck lists that it might be a card that you would consider removing, or do you think it's too integral to the format to really mess with?
I would be really hesitant to take removal like that out of the format when there's such a drought of it. You know, this is a format that doesn't have swords, that doesn't have disenchant, that doesn't have terror, that doesn't have any of those things. And I mean, it's not even a lightning bolt, really, since it's sorcery speed. But the extra clause of allowing it to bust an egg and then hit your opponent is pretty good in this kind of deck.
Yeah, definitely. And it would certainly seem like a mandatory 4 of if you were to play any type of red strategy. And red, it appears to me, is clearly one of the best colors in this format, which really does set it apart from traditional old school, where you tend to see decks dominated, or the tournaments dominated mostly by blue-based decks, splashing either white or blue, and red and green are really kind of second-tier colors.
Well, absolutely. I think red has really shown up in this format to be a very powerful color. When you remove the easy answers of ABU, there's quite a few red cards that have seen a lot of play in this format.
And they're all over Chad's deck list here. Moving to the right, of course, we see the ubiquitous Curd Ape, the mighty ape who has been dominating aggro strategies really since 1993. And no surprise that Chad is running 4 of those, and he has a substantial amount of forest to make his apes strong. It looks like he's running a total of 9 forests through 9 forests total through 4 taigas and 5 basic forests. So on average, I guess he'll have the Curd Ape up to 2-3, and certainly warrants the inclusion of 4 of those. He's got 3 copies of Rook Egg rather than 4. What do you think about the decision to not run 4 copies of such a dominant creature?
I mean, certainly the card is very good, and there are other places he could trim, but given that his deck is trying to play into the Living Plane Falling Star strategy, I think he's trying to minimize the number of, 4 drops he has here. He also wanted the Urnums. He also has the high end of the Avian and the Trike. I mean, I suppose he could clip an Avian instead of an egg. I don't know, it's a real toss-up. You're getting a 4/4 flyer either way. I suppose that the Avian is easier to kill if they have artifact destruction, but there's also ways to get rid of the token, so it's a tough call. I think that Clockwork Avian has been a card that you probably wouldn't see played in most formats, but is kind of the, Sarah Angel or Singer Vampire of this format. And I've played it in several of our tournaments in my Blue Flyers decks, and it's been very good. And I was interested to see Chad included in this list because I'm not sure the deck actually needs it, but flying's good. Flying's been very good in this format.
Yeah, certainly if you're willing to make the concession for basically a creature that's ticking down every turn. It does have a few added advantages. It can clearly be cast off generic mana. It's also immune to the Abyss, although Abyss is a restricted card in the format. And it's interesting, too, that Chad's run an entire complement of 8 huge 5 and 6 drop artifact creatures, which makes his choice to run only 3 Rook Eggs make a little bit more sense when you see that he's likely decided to run with 2 copies of Crumble instead of maybe a 4th Rook Egg and something else. And those Crumbles in a pinch allow you to gain 5 life off of a deflated Avian, or even 6 life off of a Triskelion, which is a huge instant speed boost in life that could make a really big difference when you're racing.
And we've seen in this format in particular, we've seen that life gain really swings a lot of games in a way that I don't really see it doing that in regular old school. I kind of feel like life gain is kind of a weak strategy generally, and as are many enchantments. Many enchantments are also bad typically, but in this format, those things really come into play.
Life gain as a strategy becomes more impactful whenever the format tends to slow down a little bit, and particularly when you're running ways to utilize that extra life, which is a bit interesting to me when I see that Chad has only opted to run a single copy of Sylvan Library, which I would regard as by far the most powerful card advantage engine available in Four Horsemen. What do you think about his decision to only run 1 Sylvan?
Chad's only been running 1 Sylvan for almost the entire life of this format, which I think's interesting. It's certainly a card that you could play multiple copies of, and this is actually the last tournament that it's unrestricted. Starting in T18, you will only be able to play. But given the opportunity to play more than 1, I think it's the most powerful card in the format. If you play it on turn 2, you probably win. I mean, you have card selection and they don't.
Particularly when you're trying to run combo-oriented stuff, and he definitely has that in this deck. This deck is pretty combo-y, and Sylvan's a pretty good way to, not only is it a good way to get to your combos, but the format lacks reach. There isn't a lot of direct damage in the format, given the fact that there's really the 4 chain lightnings. There's pyrotechnics at the high end, also I guess Inferno and Triskelion to a certain extent, but you're much less likely to be blown out by cards like Wheel of Fortune into Double Vice, or to not have any life because there's an Ankh of Mishra or 2 in play, or when you cast Sylvan Library and you take 8 damage off of it, and your opponent goes, "Oh, that's nice. I'm going to Psyblast you at the end of the turn, untap and double bolt you and kill you," or something. So you don't really have anywhere near that amount of direct damage, which seems to make Sylvan a lot more powerful. When I ran my deck, I guess it was tournament maybe 3 or something like that, I ran numerous copies of Sylvan Library alongside the Ivory Tower. And like you said, anytime you play Sylvan Library on turn 2, I think it spikes your win percentage by 20-30% maybe. It's just that impactful. But perhaps Chad only ran 1 Sylvan, has only been running 1 Sylvan because he's Prophet, something to that effect. I'm going to move to the right here over to, we see 1 Maze of Ith, it looks like, hiding behind Diamond Valley. And both of those cards, I believe, were unrestricted back when I played this format. Do you happen to know when those 2 were placed on the restricted list?
I think it was somewhere around tournament 9 that we started adding several of the utility lanes. We decided to drop from being a 4-strip format to a 1-strip format, and along with that came restricting a lot of these utility lands that are very good because they're just harder to deal with when there's not a bunch of strip mines flying around.
So it seems that people have kind of enforced a de facto restricted list on their own enjoyment of Magic, and it is great because it leads to a lot of natural diversity. And it's interesting to see Four Horsemen kind of moving in that direction, because when I played this format, despite the fact that, as best as I understand it, Chad made Four Horsemen because he hated stacks. He hated decks with 4 Mishra's Workshops. He did not restrict Mishra's Workshop in his own format. And it was no surprise that it was by far the best dominant strategy. I mean, why wouldn't it be? You get to play with 4 0 casting cost Black Lotuses in your deck. This is pretty insane. So I'm glad for and unsurprised to see that Workshop has been restricted in the format, and it is unequivocally the strongest card in Chad's deck, and with this particular strategy. So moving on, he's got a solo Jalem Tome. I really, really like this card a lot, and I was never really certain about how many to run. I think I ran a pair of Jalem Tomes in my deck, and I was always torn about how many I wanted to play. Have you played much with Jalem Tome? Have you found it to continue to be effective in the format?
I love it. I played mono blue for several tournaments, and so I didn't have access to Sylvan, and so Jalem Tome was my card draw engine. That's all I really had to work with, and I think it's very, very good.
Yeah, I agree. It's just a matter of feeding it, right? In that deck that I played before, which was basically Bant, it was blue, white, green, but mostly blue, white with a little splash of green for Sylvan. The Jalem Tomes were amazing, not just because of the way that they interacted with Sylvan Library, but I also ran land tax in my deck. And land tax Jalem Tome is just an incredible engine. Hard to make it work quite as well in mono blue. What did you use for card advantage in your mono blue deck?
Well, it's tough. I think mostly the strategy was just to slam flyers that had 4 toughness and then work my way through that way. But to get real card advantage is not really there. I mean, I would just pitch extra lands after I made it to 6, because Triskelion was the top of my curve, and if I got out my 1 of Workshop, I wouldn't need too much land to hold up. And now that we've restricted all the counter spells and things, you didn't really even have to hold mana up most times. It just kind of became a tap out strategy where you're slamming 2/4 flyers as fast as you can and then ditching your extra lands.
A lot of them. Lots of Drakes and Ghost Ships.
Yes.
Well, I'm very glad that Chad decided to run a single copy of Jalem Tome. And now let's move down to his bottom row, which is really where all the finishers are. So he labeled his deck as Living Plane Falling Star Part 2, and I want to talk about Living Plane as a strategy. This is a card that I've been playing Magic long enough to remember when Living Plane came out in Legends, and everybody looked at this card, and it was one of those cards that seemed like on the surface you just know that the card is good. It does such a unique thing. The way that it interferes with both mana production, the way that it allows you to create asymmetric board situations where your opponent has no land in play because you have continuous ways to kill 1/1 creatures. And it also provides a finisher. You can attack with your lands, which I kind of think is how the card was originally intended to be designed. And Chad is running not only 3 copies of Living Plane, but he's running both Falling Star and Triskelions as a way to really lean heavily on that strategy as a mid to late game land destruction strategy. In your experience watching Chad play with Living Plane, how often is he able to pull this combo off? Is it really the core part of the deck, or is it sort of like a separate thing that it does every now and then?
Well, he spent a lot of. It's interesting. He started in a very different place with this deck. It had black in it, and it was skewed a little bit differently. And we played a lot of test games. I think that out of all the brews that Chad has worked on in this format, he's probably spent the most time working on this deck. And at some point during the development, he really felt like he wanted to have two ways to win, right? Like he can either combo off, or he can just beat him to death with Curd Apes and Urnums. You know, he's got both of those options available, and I think that at least 50% of the games he just attacks. It's just an aggro strategy.
Makes sense.
But it almost makes the combo better because it's a little sneakier and it creeps up on you. They're worried about, you know, what am I going to do about this Urnum that's killing me? And they're not worried about, oh, all of a sudden you blew up all my lands, you know, and now I've lost. And I've seen it go off a number of times in the both in the test games we played and in the tournament games we played, because Chad knocked me out in the semifinals or quarterfinals. Yeah, I was playing Tax Edge, and my deck did its thing one game, and his deck did its thing one game, and then we had a game where he just beat me to death with Curd Apes. So, you know, that's how it goes, and it's a good thing that they're there because it gives him that alternate condition where he doesn't have to assemble the combo, but when he does, it's pretty devastating.
Yeah, I can see that definitely. I think that certainly if I were to build or iterate on this strategy, I think I would move more in the direction of a little bit more card draw and card filtering in the form of several JLM tomes, several Sylvan libraries, and back off a little bit on the big high-end creatures and many copies of Living Plane, maybe drop down to 2 copies of Living Plane, drop a couple of Clockwork Avians perhaps, and just try to go with a little bit more consistency and smoothness in the mid-game. Rather, because I just look at the bottom of this deck right here and I see 6, 6, 6, 6, 5, 5, 5, 5, and then 7 4-drops as well. And I know that the format is slow, but Chad's only running, as far as I can tell, 22 or 21 mana producing lands. I guess that's, 20. Well, if you count the workshop, it's 22. 22 mana producing lands and 4 Fellwar Stones, which they can be unreliable. You know, your opponent has the ability to destroy them. And if you don't draw the workshop, these 5 and 6 drops just can accumulate in your hand. It's so easy to start with 2 or 3 of them just through pure probability. And then you rip a Living Plane and you get another Living Plane. And meanwhile, the guy's just got a Serendib just bashing you in the face or something. You just feel totally helpless. But
and that's how Chad lost tournament 15. He actually lost to Serendipity, which is funny because certainly that's a great card, and we all know it is, and it's been great in regular Old School. But when you see the ebb and flow of what people play in a format as the meta adapts, that card kind of went away for a while because what would happen is everybody was playing it, and so then everyone was playing answers for it. It was getting Spirit Linked all the time. It was getting Demonic Tormented. Whatever, people would do things to it where it would just sit there and do you damage. And so for a while, everybody was like, oh, well, Serendip's not that great here. Let's stop playing it. And we didn't see it for a minute. And then suddenly, you know, someone just comes back and plays Arabian Aggro again and beats your face in with it. So it's, you know, there's definitely a push and pull. There's a rock, paper, scissors, certainly, in the top decks.
Yeah, and that Arabian Aggro strategy is actually quite a bit more powerful in the format because one of the main silver bullet against that strategy and all those efficient creatures is the City in a Bottle, and the City in a Bottle is banned from Four Horsemen for very good reason. So, yeah, it seems like there's an opportunity here, a niche for Arabian Aggro to make a resurgence, and it'd be interesting to see if that shows up in Tournament 18 as the format continues to evolve. So on Chad's bottom line here, he's running the full complement of 8 gigantic artifact creatures. And if he draws smoothly and goes land, Fellwar, land 4-drop, Avian, Triskelion, it just seems like a relentless strategy that people in the format would be hard pressed to keep up with. And I imagine if Chad has made his way all the way to the finals doing this, that is how a lot of his games have played out. at least minus the double Curd Ape draw against his poor opponent who double mulligans in the third game, which is what you explained happened in your match with him. And he's got 4 copies of the ubiquitous beater in the format, the mighty Urnam Jin as well. Are you seeing Urnam showing up on a lot of final tables now?
It's a little skewed because he's been in most of Peter's decks, and Peter is the winningest player. But it's interesting if you take his decks out of the equation, we don't see as much of them as I would think, and we don't see as much green really at all. I feel like a lot of other players are trying to lean into other colors, and even though he's only 1 green and he's easily splashable, I don't see as many people playing him as you would think.
So interesting. Yeah, my memories of this creature was just that in every format that it was legal in, particularly in the early days of standard format back in 1995, right after Chronicles released, and Urnam was everywhere. It was just the card that it really defined the format that it was in. It was so difficult to not get 2 for 1 by it at a minimum if you were playing anything but your own Urnam gens. And in this case, I imagine you get a lot of games where it's just both guys have 2 Urnam gens sitting out, and it doesn't make it, and there's other things to give Force Walk to, and you're kind of just in this weird stalemate until somebody breaks the stalemate by attacking with an Urnam and then following up with a pair of Chain Lightnings to kill the 2 blockers, or cast a Triskelion to clear them away. It's not only just a huge beater, but it's also a force of real attrition. Okay, so we've covered all of the main deck cards in Chad's strategy. I'd like to hop over to the sideboard real quick and just go over this real quick. I see 4 copies of Active Volcano. Of course, those are not going to matter at all. And I guess those are the anti-Serendib countermeasure. Chad took it a step further and ran with 2 copies of Spinal Villain, which is a card that probably, when it's played against them, most people have to read. I think that Spinal Villain is notable, most importantly, as being one of the very, very few red creatures in Legends that has more than 0 power. Because it's like a gray ogre that you can tap to destroy blue creatures. What do you think about his decision to run these Spinal Villains? I know that he was afraid of Serendipity, but he gave up 2 precious sideboard slots for this extra blue countermeasure stuff. He's got 6 anti-blue cards. Do you think that was maybe a little bit of an overreach?
I think it was overcompensation for Tournament 15 when he ran the earlier version of this deck and lost to blue. You have to have room for other things in your board as well. I know that he mentioned that he only has the 2 Presence of the Master this time, where he had 4 last time, and he wishes he still had 4 to run against certain decks, maybe even against beaters. But yeah, I think 6 cards is a lot.
It is a lot. It's one of those things, right, where you have to be. I think that when it comes to sideboarding, first of all, he did something that was very important. He figured out where his big weakness is. But the thing is that if you put 6 cards in your sideboard that are only good for that one matchup, you really screw yourself when it comes to something that isn't blue. He only has a handful of slots. With 6 cards gone, he only has, what is it? It's only 9 cards left. Yeah, 9 cards left in his sideboard to deal with every other strategy in the format.
I think part of it was just a meta call as well, because I had spent like 4 or 5 tournaments in a row placing pretty well with mono blue, and I think he was worried about playing me as well, which is funny because I didn't play mono blue in this tournament, right? So he ended up putting 6 blue cards, anti-blue cards, in his sideboard, and then when he played me, I wasn't playing that deck anymore.
Exactly. I wonder if on the way he even played against any blue decks at all. I don't know. I don't know if those Spinal Villains ever came to matter, but they may come back to haunt him in this matchup as we move down to a pair of Blood Moons. I remember thinking that Blood Moon might be a pretty attractive card for red-green or black or red-black strategies, maybe even red-white strategies, as the format continued to evolve to include dual lands, which I was a big advocate for. And I see him playing with a pair of them, and I'm curious to know, how good do you think Blood Moon is in the modern version of Four Horsemen?
Well, against the really greedy decks, it's pretty good. When we take a look at Peter's mana base here in a minute, Blood Moon's probably pretty good against it, but not quite as good as it used to be, because he's playing more basic forest than he used to because of Darkheart.
Yep.
But you know, you look at Chad's list here, and he's playing a whole bunch of non-basics too. So he does run the risk of turning all of his lands red as well, although half of his deck's red, so that probably doesn't hurt him as much. I don't know, though. Like, it feels like a bit of a trap to me. I played it in my sideboard as well, and maybe part of it's that Tax Edge is more of a combo strategy, but I guess this is too with the Living Flame Falling Star. And I'm really hesitant to side things like that in and then remove cards that might be contributing to my strategy. I feel like I'm weakening my own deck by bringing those kinds of cards in. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think about Blood Moon?
Yeah, it's one of those cards that I used to run in what was called Type 1 many, many years ago. But my whole strategy, honestly, was built around the idea of exploiting the fact that so few people were prepared to deal with the card. They would think that maybe running 1 or 2 basic land in their pure control deck made them sufficiently strong enough against Blood Moon, but that's because they were only expecting Blood Moon from mono red, or maybe from a red-white deck, and they were never expecting it from a 5-color control deck. Where
Sure.
me running 5 basic lands versus their 1 was enough that I could just play the Blood Moon, and inevitably I would just have more basic land in play, and I would win the game from there. And it's one of those cards that just seems so good on paper, and it's so hard to draw it at the right time. It's the kind of thing where you need to have it consistently on turn 2 or turn 3. And if you draw it mid-game when you're only drawing 2 copies, it doesn't do anything. And also, as you noticed before, what if your only green producers are Tygaths and Cities of Brass, and you can't even play a Blood Moon? So again, it's like one of those cards that's it's right on the fringe of either being totally useless or totally amazing, and you don't know how many to run. And 2 of a card like that just doesn't really make any sense to me either. So I'd be curious to talk to Chad to see how effective the Blood Moons were in his matchups and whether or not he would continue to run multiple copies of them. But it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in the final matchup. He's got over there 3 copies of Artifact Blast. What do you think these are in there for now that the workshops are gone from the format for the most part?
I think they're just to counter trikes. He doesn't want somebody playing their own trike when he's thinking about dropping a living plane. And it's really the only good answer to that, because if you let them play the trike, it doesn't matter if you can kill it. They can shoot the arms off anyway. So it's purely an anti-trike card, which is also funny because Peter, despite trike being one of the very best cards in this format, doesn't play it usually. I don't know if he has a couple in his list this time, but traditionally he has not played it at all in any of his winning lists.
Yeah, well, we'll just have to discuss that. But it's interesting that Chad has sideboarded against a card that his 10 tournament winning opponent has deemed not even worth playing. So it'll be interesting to see how those 2 things match up, and we'll certainly talk about Triskelion, or the lack of Triskelion in Peter's deck when we get over there. And let's move over now to 2 copies of a card that I'm sure a lot of people who are not familiar with Four Horsemen would look at that artwork and go, "What the hell is that thing?" Presence of the Master, the picture, I guess, of Einstein on it. Presence of the Master is, as far as I can tell, outside of a card like Desert Twister, really the only way to deal with enchantments in Four Horsemen, which is kind of one of the biggest gaping holes in the format strategically. What do you think about Presence of the Master, and have you seen people running it a fair amount?
It's a card that we didn't see at all until a couple tournaments ago. I played, I had mentioned already that I was playing mono blue, and I was playing a deck that didn't have any enchantments in it, despite the fact that enchantments are pretty good in this format. My answer was to bounce them and potentially make them discard them. I would bounce them with either Boomerang or one of my favorite cards in this format, Time Elemental. And then I would hit them with a... I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of that 6-drop from the dark, Amnesia, that makes them discard everything. And so I could, over time, just send all the enchantments back to their hand and then make them discard them. But I lost tournament, I think 14. I might have to go back and look, but I think it was 14. I made it to the finals, and I lost to a deck that was almost all enchantments. And I said, well, next time I have to splash white and come back with Presence of the Master.
Yeah, makes sense.
And the next time I played against a deck like that, they beat me game 1, and then game 2, I just jammed a turn 3 Presence of the Master after having played a Fellwar Stone, and suddenly they couldn't play 90% of the cards in their deck, and I, just proceeded to just play creatures and kill them.
Yeah.
It's an interesting card that just shuts off a huge swath of deck strategies.
And it feels almost mandatory if you're trying to play a long-term control strategy and you don't have the ability to remove something that's already in play with Disenchant, which you kind of take for granted in the old school format. The problem is with Presence of the Master is that it doesn't work if the cards are already in play. If your opponent starts with Sylvan Library and then they play Dark Heart of the Wood the next turn, and then you play Presence of the Master, you're kind of already screwed.
Yeah, and land tax too. I mean, it's a one drop, so
exactly.
they're probably going to land a copy before you're able to, get that out. So outside of being able to bounce the thing back to their hand, they're going to get to keep it.
Yeah, just a fundamental limitation, I guess, of trying to play a more control-oriented strategy in the format. And to the right of the Presence of the Masters, I see 2 copies of Mirror Universe, which is really interesting to me because when I first started playing Four Horsemen years ago, a year and a half ago, or whenever the format debuted, I targeted Mirror Universe as being one of the most exploitable cards in the format due to the fact that as a purist, Chad wanted this format to be a real throwback to the 93-94 era, which included the old antiquated rules, particularly the rules pertaining to both mana burn and the timing of when you would die relative to the phases of the turn. And that made Mirror Universe incredibly powerful in multiple axes. Not only can you mana burn yourself down to 1 and swap life with your opponent easily using mana burn, but you could literally use it to kill your opponent in a way that wasn't even interactive, because you could mana burn during the end step, you could mana burn during the untap step before your opponent could even cast anything. And the only time your opponent would have a chance to interact with you is when you were already in upkeep. And if they were to bolt you down to negatives, you didn't die till the end of the phase. There was no way to get around it. And consequently, I finished most of my games in that format using Mirror Universe. Now, of course, using the modern rules templating, you can't use Mirror Universe to do that anymore. Do you think the card is still worth running?
There's a lot of games that go long, and there's a lot of life gain right now. I'm not sure going forward how good it'll be now that we've started to restrict some of the life gain cards. But there are certainly games that I've seen it swing where somebody's in a very dominant position, and then suddenly a mirror gets dropped, and they don't have an answer for it, and that's just it. They just flip the game and flip the win. But generally, I don't think it's the best answer in the world, and the fact that you have to wait until your next upkeep to use it a lot of times just makes it feel like either a dead card or maybe a win more card. I don't know. I haven't seen it actually turn any big games in any of our finals. I've certainly seen it show up in the pod matches, but not so much in the finals matches.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how much of it plays a factor in this matchup, because I would say that it would be an interesting kind of sideboard card to bring out against someone who's planning on gaining a ton of life via Dark Heart of the Wood, and you could sort of play Mirror Universe when you're super low, and because your opponent can't mana burn, there's no way for him to create life parity, and you do a big life switch and then bolt him out or kill him with a Triskelion. But Peter's likely to be boarding in a lot of artifact kill against Chad's artifacts, which means that the Mirror Universe may just wind up dying to splash damage either way. It'll be cool to see if he decides ultimately to board those in. And I think that would make a good segue into Chad's opponent. Peter Solt is playing a deck that he has described as a Dark Library Aggro Burn. That's a lot of different ideas all wrapped up into one deck. And boy, is this deck intricate and interesting. I'm going to just start, I guess, diving right into the cards here. And one final thing I did want to mention about Chad's strategy is that acceleration is mandatory in the format. And it looks like, based on the card pool, there's really only 2 ways to go faster. Since there's no Moxes, there's no Soul Ring, no Mana Vault, no Dark Ritual. There isn't really any way to accelerate your strategy. You can't even play with Llanowar Elves. And Chad went with the 4 Felwar Stone plan. And Peter has gone in a different direction with that, which we will cover as we move on to his deck. So in the upper left-hand corner, 4 copies of the Mighty Rookeg. Can't say I'm surprised to see that. We talked about before about why that card is so impactful. And playing red-green, I'm not remotely surprised to see that Peter is running with 4 copies of those. And just to the right of that, we have what I regard as probably the best accelerator in the format. Elves of Deep Shadow, which he is using not only for its essentially colorless mana generation in his mostly red-green deck, but he's actually utilizing black. What do you think about the idea to run Elves of Deep Shadow, and have you seen them in a lot of red-green decks just as an accelerator, or is this something that Peter has honed in on himself?
They showed up a lot early, and then they kind of disappeared the same way that Saren did for a while did. But they're coming back around. I personally like them because they can also attack, and you can also hit it with your Pendelhaven and get in for some, ancillary damage here and there. I certainly like having that ability stapled onto a creature. It's not quite a Llanowar elf, but it's the one that we have in this format.
Exactly. You go to war with the troops you have right now, with the ones that you want.
Absolutely.
And at least he has taken advantage of the fact that he does have a use. He does have a use for black mana, unlike a lot of the red-green strategies that would just be using this as an extremely painful Llanowar elf. He's running 4 copies of the ubiquitous Chain Lightning, as well as 4 copies of Kurdape and 4 copies of Urnam Jin. All of those things seem like red-green staples. And then we hit a big departure from Chad's strategy. Peter's running 3 copies of Pyrotechnics, which is a card that I've always actually really enjoyed. I played Pyrotechnics. I think I played at least 2 and maybe even 3 copies of Pyrotechnics back when I first started playing what was then called Type 2 format in a red-white deck that I played for years. And I was always very impressed with Pyrotechnics when I played it. I got card advantage with it all the time, particularly post-combat, when you could attack with things and your opponent would block in intricate ways with factories and stuff, and then you just blow them out with Pyrotechnics. So Peter's running 3 copies of that. Have you played Pyrotechnics a bunch in any of your decks, or have you stayed away from the card in the same way that Chad did?
I'm a red mage at heart, so I've definitely run all the good red cards in this format from time to time before I switched over to the mono blue strategy. But I do like the nature of being able to either 2 or 3 for 1 them in some cases. I find that pretty powerful, and then also, of course, being able to go to the face and finish a game if you need to.
Exactly, in a format that's really, really hard up for direct damage, and the fact that you can just draw a couple Pyrotechnics and just put your opponent away, particularly if they've been Sylvaning and stuff. And this is a big difference between Peter's deck and Chad's deck. Chad's deck is really vulnerable to burn. He has those 2 crumbles to gain life, and he has the Diamond Valley, but outside of those 3 effects, and if he takes early damage, if he takes damage off Cities of Brass and so on, even though he isn't running a full complement of those, he could just lose a long game by just getting killed by multiple Pyrotechnics and Chain Lightnings to the face, which is a big vulnerability that I think he has that Peter does not. And in addition to the fact that Pyrotechnics is really good for breaking those stalemates between 4 or 5 creatures, because if you attack with an Urnam, your opponent blocks with an Urnam, and you finish it off with Chain Lightning, you're down a Chain Lightning and 3 damage. If you're finishing it with Pyrotechnics, you still get to deal 3 extra to their face on top of killing their Urnam while yours lives, and that's a big advantage. And I imagine that could really come up in these games. Moving down, also, we see Peter playing with 1 copy of a card that I'm very happy to see it. I've played with the card in Old School Cubes a fair amount of times. Fissure. He's running a single copy of Fissure. Have you seen Fissure played a fair amount in Four Horsemen?
It's so good. It's so good in this format. I know that it seems silly, but when a lot of the other removal's gone, I mean, having instant speed, kill anything, and maybe kill a problematic land if you have to.
Totally.
It's pretty cool. I think it's a great card in this format.
Yeah. I think it's another card that really gives Peter a bit of an advantage in this matchup. For example, Maze of Ith is a card that is powerful and I imagine pretty ubiquitous, although Peter has decided not to run one of those because I think he just believes that he can't spare another land that doesn't produce mana. And the fact that Fissure can take out a Maze of Ith at instant speed can catch his opponent with his pants down. The opponent goes, oh, I'm going to be totally fine. That Urnam's not going to hit me for 4. I'm good. And at the end of the turn, nope, instant speed, remove your Maze of Ith, untap, and kill you kind of thing happens. So very neat to see him playing with the card. It also just makes him more prepared to deal with those 4 and 5 toughness creatures in Chad's deck. He's got 3 copies of the Falling Star, which we talked about before, and I think that it'll be interesting to see how this matchup shapes up with regards to the fact that both people are playing with 3 copies of Falling Star. And if they get into a stalemate where they're both kind of just staring at each other with a wall of Urnams and Kurdapes and so on, the Falling Stars could be the deciding factor because they tap your opponent down. You could just cast 2 Falling Stars and tap out their entire team and hit them for 12 or something. There isn't really any instant speed answer to that. Yeah. So What do you think about the fact that this bizarre card from Legends that has really never ever seen play in Old School could be the deciding factor in Tournament 17 of the Four Horsemen event?
I think it's great because it hasn't really it hasn't been as big yet in this format as we thought it would be, and so maybe this is the time. This is the time for Falling Star to be the star card.
Very appropriate.
Indeed.
We mentioned the fact that this card is a little bit on the Four Horsemen watch list now, and do you think that that's warranted?
Yeah, I do, but at the same time, it's kind of like how we talked about Chain Lightning, and I would be hesitant to take it away. I'm not saying that they're of equal power level, but there's so few cards like this. I mean, certainly it's powerful to have both the tap ability and the damage ability. That probably sets it apart. But there's no like Earthquake in this format. Normally you would be able to just Earthquake all of their stuff away, but that doesn't exist. And so I think that it's fair to have the colors do what the colors are supposed to do. And for red to have this kind of effect is pretty good. Although I think that red's pretty stacked compared to some of the other colors in this format with the ABU cards gone.
Yeah, definitely. I would put it way ahead of both black and white, for example. That's certainly evidenced in the fact that we've got two very, very heavily red-dominated decks in the finals of this event. But you kind of expect that. As formats tend to evolve, there's always going to be something that's the best strategy. And so you try to be malleable and constantly shift the format away from whatever the most dominant strategy is, particularly when it goes across multiple events. So it'll be interesting to see as Four Horsemen continues to evolve into the future, how many of these red cards either become watch listed or outright find themselves on the restricted list. And speaking of cards on the restricted list, a big departure from the format when I played it is a single copy of Ivory Tower, which Chad has decided not to use. And it's interesting to see that Peter's run a copy of Ivory Tower, which goes perfectly well with his 3 currently unrestricted Sylvan libraries, which I really like. I think 2 to 3 Sylvans, if you're playing green, is basically the mandatory number in the format. The card definitely seems worthy of restriction. And Peter's run with 3, which is, I think, the number that I settled on as well. So very good to see him running that. And it pairs so magnificently with the core of his deck, not coincidentally sitting right at the dead center of the screenshot, 2 copies of Dark Heart of the Wood. Let's talk about Dark Heart of the Wood. It is my impression, even though I haven't followed Four Horsemen for a little over a year, that this card has risen to the very, very top and is now going onto the restricted list. What do you think about that?
Yeah, between the Ivory Tower and the Dark Heart, we've been seeing some very long matches. And that's one of the things that we're kind of trying to cut back on a little bit. Certainly it's fun to be able to swing a game here and there with a little bit of life gain, but when you get an entire engine going where you're able to land tax, sack all your forests, put them back in your deck, get them again, sack them again, you basically become unkillable. And it's really interesting because you kind of look at this pile of cards with a lot of these 1-of and 2-ofs in the middle, and it kind of looks like a mess on the surface to me. But I think that this deck is the result of Peter playing similar strategies for so many different tournaments that this is what he's arrived at. This is what he's honed in on. And so he wants to make sure that he's playing all of these powerful strategies together at once and try to make them function together. I had a hard time. I played a bunch of test games with this deck against Chad, and I had a really hard time casting things. I had a lot of unfavorable hands. I had a lot of mulligans. And so it was difficult, but obviously it's working for Peter. So, we'll keep going through the cards here, but like the drop of honey, like there's only one, and like there's one in the sideboard. It seems kind of strange on the surface to me, but I think there's a method to the madness here.
I would tend to agree, and in fact, I went and played a fair number of test draws with both of these decks in my own spare time over the last couple of days. I wanted to be more versed in what was going on with them, and I'll relay my own experience in testing as soon as we get to kind of the matchup, the final matchups phase of this commentary. But interesting that he went with 2 copies of Dark Heart of the Wood. I think that's probably correct. I would imagine that a third one is just a little bit too redundant, and you have to remember there's no way to really remove enchantments in this format, which means that 2 copies of a card like this, where you don't necessarily, it's not like Blood Moon or Presence of the Master, where you need that card right at the beginning in the matchups that it's really good for. you can get by with 2 Dark Hearts of the Wood in the sense that they're likely to show up right around that stage of the game where you're going to be concerned about your life total. When you're getting down into the mid to low single digits and you're worried that your opponent is going to kill you with a pair of Chain Lightnings or a Triskelion or something. And that's when you play the Dark Heart of the Wood, or you hopefully have it in hand and you're ready to go with it. And above that is a really interesting enchantment that when I first looked at Peter's list, I went, what on earth is he playing with Gate to Phyrexia for? How on earth is he going to cast a card that costs BB in a red-green deck? So strange. Have you seen Gate to Phyrexia in many lists? I actually really, really like this card a lot.
I think it's very cool, and I ran it in my blacklist, of course, because it's easy to cast there.
Yeah.
But we haven't seen it as much because we're seeing a lot of red-green strategies and blue-white strategies, and just decks that can't really cast it. I mean, there is a black-white enchantment control deck that won tournament 14 and did very well, and we've seen other players try to play that strategy. So it's all right there, but there's not a lot of creatures in that deck to sack to the enchantment. But the ability to destroy artifacts over and over seems very good.
And not just that, too, but it gives you an outlet to sack your own Rook Eggs as well. Think about that.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, I would go so far as to say that if Peter draws this single copy of Gate to Phyrexia and he's able to play it, Chad has almost no way to win the game. It's so good against the range of what Chad's deck is doing. He's got 12 artifacts, actually 13 from memory. I need to go look at his list real quick. Yeah, it looks like it's 13. And and the average CMC between 8 of them is 5.5 mana. So from a tempo perspective, assuming that the artifacts weren't cast off of a workshop, sacking something like an Elves of Deep Shadow to destroy a 6-drop or a 5-drop is so much of a tempo advantage. And on top of that, he might be sacking a Rook Egg to kill a Clockwork Avian, which gives him a free 4/4. Card advantage, creature destruction, threat, all in one, and it only costs 2 black. What a cool metagame call. It'll be amazing to see if Gate to Phyrexia shows up and whether or not it really shines in the matchup if he's able to get it in play in a timely manner, which is not a given by any measure. He does not have a huge amount of black sources.
I was never able to cast it in any of the test games that I had it in my hand. It just sat in my hand, stuck there, because I only ever got 1 black mana. But I'm sure that it's possible. I mean, with the elves,
yeah. It's interesting. There's 1 copy of it, right? It's like one of those things where you look at it on paper and you go, this is never going to come up at a time when it matters. And then all of a sudden, turn 1, Elves of Deep Shadow. Turn 2, City of Brass, Gate to Phyrexia. Go ahead, Mr. Artifact player. And Chad's looking at his hand like, wow, I'm really, really dead here. I've got 2 Clockwork Avians and a Fellwar Stone and some lands and no chance whatsoever in the game. So it'll be cool to see if it factors in the matchup. By the way, I don't know, is this a best of 3 or are they playing best of 5 in the finals?
Just 3. We're sticking to 3. We talked early on about potentially going to 5 games, and we felt like it was just too much of a drag, honestly.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. I mean, given how long the games could wind up going, we could be looking at a 2.5 to 3 hour matchup, and I don't think we want to put the players or the audience through that kind of an ordeal.
Sure.
Makes sense. All right, so moving to the left, Inferno, 7 mana, instant speed, kill everything in play. Pretty much the closest thing that the format has to a symmetric Wrath of God. I guess there's Hellfire, which I believe you've run in one of your mono black decks before, but Inferno is the symmetric Wrath of God effect. And
yes.
Peter's running 1 copy of them. It synergizes beautifully with the Rook Eggs as well. The instant speed component of it allows you to really play it to maximum effect. And I think this is the kind of format where Inferno can really shine because, again, it is so slow and methodical and plotting, and these games are likely to go long. I think that could be another huge factor in the matchup.
Yeah, I love it. I played a list that ran 4 of them early on because I was enamored with the idea that it was kind of the only sweeper. And of course, the ability to also dome them for the extra damage too is always appealing to me, having that extra reach.
Yeah,
but,
and extra powerful with the life gain strategy too.
Yeah, and it does enough damage to kill things like Urnums. I mean, there's not really anything that survives it in the format unless it's somehow buffed up by an enchantment or whatever.
King Suleiman. King Suleiman's, I guess, a card that does it. Knights of Thorn would be, I don't know, it'd be very interesting to see Knights of Thorn against a deck like this, because a lot of sticky, problematic pro-red banding white creatures are actually really, really good against red-green decks. Red-green decks don't really have a way through that other than flying over with Rook Egg. So something to consider for tournament 18, 19, etc. I noticed
there's a couple of Legends creatures that have pro-red as well. I think that somebody could build kind of a cute deck that has a bunch of pro-red and a bunch of Infernos. I don't know how good it would actually be, but
yeah,
the deck's there if somebody wants to build it.
It is certainly there. At a certain point, you do have to gain life also, because Inferno does damage you. We've got one copy of Feldon's Cane, and I know that this card has been targeted and discussed as something that also makes matches interminable in the format, but Peter has only run one copy of it, and that's got to be read. I'm not a huge fan of Feldon's Cane in general as an effect. I don't like the fact that it's negative card advantage in a format where you're really starving to get card advantage. But if any deck should be running a copy of Feldon's Cane, it's probably something like this, where you have the ability to both land tax and sack your lands to keep your head above water kind of in perpetuity. And then eventually you pull all the lands out of your deck and you sack them all, and then you go, okay, I'm just going to play this Feldon's Cane that I drew a few turns ago and get all the lands back in my deck and continue the cycle and be essentially immortal.
Yeah, it's only good in tandem with other cards. I mean, simply putting more cards in your deck doesn't do anything. You have to draw them. I'm also not a huge fan of Feldon's Cane on its own. It's funny, it was a card that everybody at my kitchen table had one of when we played,
Totally.
in 1995 or whatever. So it's kind of iconic in that sense. And it's funny, we talked about the artifact blasts earlier in Chad's deck, and I think he's so worried about this Feldon's Cane and also about the Ivory Tower that I think that's another reason why he's playing the artifact blasts, because it's really the only way to stop the Cane, because otherwise you can't destroy it with Crumble, because they'll just activate it.
Yeah.
So you have to counter it.
I would feel so terrible from Chad's perspective having to play artifact blast against this deck.
It's sad, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an example where you lose almost every way that those cards intersect, because you draw artifact blast when your opponent plays Curd Ape Elves of Deep Shadow, and you go, wow, I just ripped my second artifact blast, how wonderful. And then you have the reverse. You've got 3 artifact blasts in your deck, and your opponent goes turn 1 Ivory Tower, and you go, god damn it, now I'm going to draw these blanks. It's sort of, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, and all Peter has to do is just play his regular game. And the threat of those 2 cards alone forces Chad into this really uncomfortable spot. I wanted to move down to a really, really cool, interesting inclusion in Peter's deck. 1 copy of Drop of Honey. And when I first looked at this deck, I went, this card, and at the deck list in general, I said, why on earth is he playing Drop of Honey? He's running 4 copies of Elves of Deep Shadow. What are the chances that his creatures are the smallest ones in play? What are the chances?
Cracks the eggs. Cracks the
eggs, exactly. It cracks the eggs, and you have control over it, right? You get to choose if there's a tie. So you play Drop of Honey, and you're like, well, we both have 2 Rook Eggs in play. Guess whose 2 are breaking first? And Chad will be dead before the Drop of Honey finally pops the other one. Or at least he'll be so low in life it won't even matter. So Drop of Honey, again, 1 copy of it could come up at exactly the right time and completely make the situation impossible for Chad. It also, if Peter doesn't have any small creatures in play, it gives him a 1 mana opportunity to kill multiple Urnums or multiple Clockwork Avians or something before he takes lethal damage. Because he has so much life gain in the deck that he could kind of weather the storm while his opponent is beating on him for 4 or even 8 damage a turn. And the Drop of Honey could still wind up killing off a couple of big creatures. That said, you could also play Drop of Honey, and Chad's got Living Plane in play, and it does basically nothing, because I'm sure his opponent could afford to sack a couple of creatures while he was in the process of winning the game. It wouldn't even make that big of a difference. So another card that could have a huge impact, just like Gate to Phyrexia, these interesting singletons, Inferno, Gate to Phyrexia, Drop of Honey, Feldon's Cane, all of them could be very, very consequential and could make the matchup a lot more interesting. And speaking of interesting, let's move to the 2 white cards in this already variegated deck. 2 copies of Land Tax. What on earth? How is he even casting Land Tax in this deck with reliability? And has he been able to do that? I only see 8 white sources. Do you think that that's enough white sources to get away with running 2 Land Tax? Is he even intending to play the card early? Or is this like Dark Heart of the Woods, something he's going to be playing mid-game instead? What do you think?
I think he's going to have to play it mid-game. It's interesting because it's a card that you want to play to fix your mana, but when it's your fourth color that you're running the least of, it doesn't really fix your mana anymore. You know, it only becomes a combo piece for later on.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't think he's worried about drawing it early. I think he just wants to assemble the combo later in the game.
Yeah, it reminds me. I don't know if you can hear the sound of cards being shuffled and manipulated in the background, but I've got a deck right here in my hands, which is a Canadian Highlander deck, of course, by default singleton, and I run one copy of Scroll Rack and one copy of Land Tax in the deck, and the Land Tax in this deck is designed exactly for, I think, the same purpose that Land Tax is in Peter's deck. I'm not intending to play Land Tax turn one. I might not even do it, actually, because it's not important for me necessarily to start pulling tons of lands out of my deck at the beginning. There's other things I can do anyway, like just developing my strategy and playing creatures. And then later on in the game, that little ubiquitous Land Tax that's been sitting there and you're thinking, oh, I've got parity, or maybe he's 2 lands ahead of me. And then all of a sudden, down comes Dark Heart of the Wood, end of the turn, sacrifice 3 forests, gain 9, untapped, fetch up 3, and now you are in deep shit against him. And so the card has the ability to really, really push the game long, and it gets more and more insane, particularly when it's combined with Feldon's Cane and Sylvan Library and stuff. So it is actually a really interesting integral part of his Sylvan Library long-term card advantage strategy, and I think 2 is probably the perfect number. It's just a matter whether or not he can cast it with 8 white sources, but again, he's not intending to cast it early. So maybe 8 white sources is enough, in fact. Pretty cool. It's very, very cool and unique design, and I can completely understand why this deck has done so well in the tournament. I mean, he swept quarter and semifinals 2-0, if I'm not correct, or if I'm not wrong with that.
I believe so, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So Land Tax is probably the number one card that the player base is saying, well, why didn't you restrict this card? You know, why are you restricting things like Dark Heart of the Wood instead of this? But our rationale, at least for now, is that Tax Edge is a viable deck that has never won one of these tournaments. It's done well a couple of times, but people seem to enjoy playing that deck. It's fun to have combo in your format. You know, I think any healthy format should have aggro, combo, and control.
Right.
And if we get rid of that card, that deck's just gone. And maybe that'll happen eventually. You know, even if we restrict it, that deck's gone, because that's a deck that does want to play that card on turn 1.
Yeah. Maybe you just need to consider it collateral damage, or the loss of the Tax Edge deck to be a collateral damage. And the thing is that I get that you guys are all waiting for a Tax Edge deck to win an event before you want to restrict land tax, but maybe that's just a wrong way to approach it. Maybe Tax Edge just isn't good enough to win in this format, and the presence of land tax enables broken strategies like land tax, Dark Heart of the Wood, Silver.
That's the argument to get rid of it, certainly.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's the next card on the chopping block, I think. I mean, I think we ran with the last banned and restricted, the one that is live in this tournament 17 for 3 or 4 tournaments, and I think people were pretty happy with it. And they never made much of a ruckus when we added lands or anything like that to the list, or Mana Drain or Recall or any of the cards that probably should be there to begin with. But in this last one, when we added a couple of the draw cards, we added Sylvan because we felt like it was super powerful. We added Greed, and we added Dark Heart. And when we did that without doing anything with land tax, there was definitely a little bit of a fervor. Hey, wait a minute. Why don't you just get rid of land tax and not get rid of the other cards it's enabling?
Exactly.
You know, we had a pretty big discussion about it between Chad, Peter, and I, and that's where we ended up arriving. But it's certainly possible that in the future, in quarter 2 of this year or later, maybe land tax just bites it.
What's interesting too is that restricting it would weaken this strategy, but it would not obsolesce it entirely. The deck would still function with just a single copy of land tax, because again, he's not trying to cast it early in the game. And I do think that this deck would be gutted with a restriction of Sylvan Library, which seems to be the way that those two cards interact, because as powerful as Sylvan Library is, the card isn't really at peak power until you have a consistent way to reshuffle. And land tax gives you the way to reshuffle with Sylvan Library every single turn, even if you're not fetching land. Even if you run out of lands to fetch, you can still trigger the card every turn and get it and look at a fresh 3 every single draw step. So that in and of itself, and its interactions with Sylvan Library, I don't know, maybe both of them restricted. At a certain point, you kind of wonder what your format is turning into, though, right? You remove all of the cool interaction, and now you're just basically playing a bunch of vanilla creatures. That's
this is the balance that we're trying to strike, right? We want to have a format that still has fun things to do, fun cards to play, you know, and certainly putting them on the restricted list still allows them to be played. I mean, a card like Darkheart or Land Tax in this deck, one copy isn't that much different than two copies. I mean, certainly it decreases the frequency a bit, but Darkheart #2 doesn't do anything. You know, like once you get one of them in play, the other one is obsolete. You don't really need it.
Yeah, particularly with unrestricted Sylvan, because with four and Peter, I'm sure would just go straight up to 4 Sylvan libraries if either one of those enchantments was restricted for this event, because then he just has more opportunities to cycle through draws to look for those 2 singletons, and once he has one of those 2 singletons in play, the Sylvans just rev up in power, and the whole engine comes online instantly. If you're going to restrict one, it's like you restrict all 3 of them, and the biggest culprit might just be the Sylvan library itself, which is the big power outlier. Again, Chad is a prophet, and he's ahead of the curve with his single copy and not relying on more than one.
He was just stealing himself for the inevitable.
Exactly, for the inevitable. All right, I want to move on to the lands. And when I first looked at Peter's deck list, I saw his spell count, I saw his multicolored qualities, and I saw the amount of lands in the deck, and I instinctively thought, you know what? I don't think this deck has enough lands in it to really perform consistently. I would not feel comfortable running only 21 land alongside 2 generic mana producers in order to run this mana base. But the truth is that his deck is actually, it has effectively quite a bit more mana than Chad's does, because his CMC is so much lower. His average CMC is much, much lower than Chad's. Chad is running Fellwar Stones instead of Elves of Deep Shadow. Chad is running a whole complement, 12 gigantic monsters starting at 4 and going all the way up to 6. Peter has a single Inferno, and Peter's deck is actually really, really lean in terms of casting cost. He does have the 3 Pyrotechnics, he does have the Fissures, but those cards tend to be more reactive rather than just slamming them onto the battlefield over and over again, and they're more tolerant of not necessarily hitting the casting cost of one of those cards on curve. Creatures, you got to really hit them on curve, particularly on big creatures. Otherwise, they just accumulate in your hand and you just fall behind. And then at that point, it doesn't even matter what you're playing, because if your opponent has removal, or they can just attack, they can just alpha strike you and kill you. And you don't have the ability to remove anything. So in Chad's deck, his big creatures kind of are his defense. And because of that reason, I think it's very, very easy for Peter to just get ahead. And if Chad is not able to ramp straight up to 5 mana, straight up to 5 or 6 mana, he could fall prey to the fact that Peter's average casting cost is substantially lower. And I do think that his 21 land assortment, combined with the Elves of Deep Shadow and the backup in the form of those 2 land taxes, and even kind of in a weird way, the Ivory Tower, is actually sufficient mana. Plus, he has 3 Sylvans. And if you play a Sylvan library on a 2-land hand, the odds that you untap and you're unable to draw another land through the top 3 cards of your deck are pretty low, even when you only are running 21 lands. So I do actually think it is pretty much the right number, even though that wasn't my initial impression. It really kind of comes down to colored mana. And I know that you had an experience playing this deck a fair amount in practice, and you said that you were constantly mulliganing and mana screwed with it and stuff. I did not have that experience myself. I guess I could talk about my own playtest at this point, because I ran 10 games each. I didn't have an opportunity to play them against each other, just because putting together 2 of these decks, 2 full constructed decks from your like random cards on your wall and in your safe and stuff is difficult. But I did build them both on Magic Online. And I just took a bunch of test draws where I would run through the first 4 or 5 turns, and I paid attention to how many times I had to mulligan between the 2 decks. I had to mulligan a total of 4 times with Peter's deck across 10 games, and Chad's deck had to mulligan 6 times, including 2 double mulligans. So I actually found that Peter's deck was more tolerant of opening hands and had to mulligan less. Obviously, my sample size is small. It's only 10 games each. Instinctively, I actually think that Peter's deck, when you don't factor in the fact that his Dark Heart of the Wood and Land Tax need to be cast early in the game, that Peter's deck is actually more tolerant of opening draws and has to mulligan fewer times. Do you share my experience with that, or do you think that it's...
No, I think that's right. I mean, because a lot of these other splash cards, he really doesn't need to ever play early, and certainly he can hit red or green early and do okay.
I mean, he can get unlucky, right? I mean, he can get an opening hand of I don't know, something like Plains, Pendlehaven, Forest with 2 land taxes and a gate to fire Xe or some nightmare hand. But you can just mulligan that. You can just mulligan one of those hands and come back with a 7 card hand where it is much more cohesive and will work well. And
sometimes in a discussion like this too, I think about real life shuffling of cards versus digital shuffling of cards, right? Like you had a computer randomizing your draws and you got whatever result, you know. And I don't know if maybe I was shuffling poorly or not enough or whatever, but I definitely got into a rut where suddenly I couldn't get a good draw.
Interesting, yeah.
And some of that's just luck. Right?
Of course it's luck and a small sample size, but of course you, as a human being, you are not a random number generator when it comes to shuffling. So there may be just patterns and stuff, and it might just be a matter of frustration. You know, a lot of the time people will mulligan because their deck just happens to be poorly sequenced. And instead of doing a full, thorough 6-pile shuffle and taking 3 minutes to do it, they just do a couple of quick riffles and then they deal out another hand.
Right.
They cut straight back into the same part of the deck that they were just in, and they think, oh my God, I'm so unlucky there's no land in the deck, without doing a sufficient shuffle. And usually in casual playtesting of somebody else's deck, you're unlikely to put in the time to do a full, thorough shuffle like you would in a tournament. Okay, so I want to move over to the sideboard. Let's start with the very top. I see 2 copies of Concordant Crossroads. I'm sure for people in the audience who are unfamiliar with Four Horsemen, why is Peter running 2 copies of Concordant Crossroads in his sideboard, John?
So this is an interesting include. The only deck that I've ever really seen them in this format is Eureka, when you want to be able to drop a bunch of big stuff and attack with it right away. But I'm a little bit puzzled. Maybe you have a better insight as to what matchup you might want to use this card in.
Yeah, you normally think of this card as being paired with large creatures that want to come out and attack immediately. In fact, I remember building a variant on a deck that I played kind of more for fun back in the old Type 1 days that I called Dance of the Greedy Djinns. And it ran 4 copies of Urnam Djinn and Juzam Djinn, and I think 2 or 3 copies of Serendib Djinn and copies of Dance of Many alongside Diamond Valley and Greed. And Concordant Crossroads is a really, really good card in that deck because not only was it a lot of damage out of nowhere, but I didn't really care about my creatures remaining in play. I certainly didn't want to pay upkeep on the the Dance of Many tokens. So with Concordant Crossroads in play, I could attack with a Serendib Djinn that was a token and then sack it immediately, gain 6 life, draw 3 cards off of Greed using the 6 life and continue on my merry way. My only guess is that he's running Concordant Crossroads because it's one of the few enchant worlds in this format that costs 1 mana. And he probably doesn't want to play with a card like Storm World because it just doesn't do enough. Concordant Crossroads at least has an added benefit of allowing his guys to have haste. And perhaps Peter is worried about maybe it's just the Abyss. I mean, certainly his deck is very, very vulnerable to the Abyss. If Abyss
it does kill the Abyss. That is what it does, and maybe that's why it's there.
Yeah, it's interesting. But he went with a copy of Concordant Crossroads over something a little bit more flexible, like Desert Twister. Whereas if his opponent played Abyss, and it is a restricted card, and I'm sure he knew that it was restricted, so running 2 copies of Concordant Crossroads to combat what might be a singular Abyss in his opponent's black control deck of some sort, which I can't imagine there are really many decks that even play the Abyss. It just seems weird to me. So it'll be interesting to ask Peter at some point why he ran with Concordant Crossroads. Maybe there's something that is not on our radar.
We have seen a rise of creatureless control decks, so that is a thing that you're going to face in this format. At least a few tournaments ago, I think we're seeing it turn back over.
Yeah,
and seeing more. We're seeing a lot more red green.
It would sure feel bad. Yeah, it would sure feel bad to lose to the Abyss, though. I mean, you'd just be like, God damn it, why didn't I prepare? I just needed a couple copies of Concordant Crossroads to deal with it, and I'd be fine. So that's probably the reason. To the left, he's got 3 copies of Crumble and no artifact blasts at all in the sideboard. And what do you think about the decision to not run any main deck artifact kill at all?
I think it's okay. There are good artifacts in the format for sure, but I think as we've seen the format evolve, you're seeing less of them. Maybe you would want something in your main board. I know in previous iterations of this deck, he's had Scavenger Folks, and so he's been able to lean into those and then bring in extra crumbles on top of them if he needs to. Yeah. But it's funny that he went to a complete, a 180 where he has no artifact removal at all in the main board.
With the restriction of Mishra's Workshop, Crumble is just so much less valuable in the main deck anyway. And cards like Detonate and stuff seem like they're completely obsolete. I didn't see Detonate in either of these sideboards.
Yeah, that's true, and that's a card that we saw a lot more of previously. And certainly, you know, when it's good, it's great. You blow something up big and also do damage. But having these utility answers that only cost 1 seems better.
Yeah. Let's move over to 4 copies of Whirling Dervish. I got to say, I'm very, very surprised to see Whirling Dervish in Peter's sideboard. Is there some mono black deck in the meta with a lot of ground-based creatures that these guys are in there for that I don't know about?
There isn't, but we just talked about how he might have been worried about the Abyss, and maybe like how Chad has 6 anti-blue cards. For some reason, Peter has six anti-Abyss cards in his sideboard, right?
But it might just be one of those cards that he's planning on bringing him in not just against mono black, but against a slower strategy, where if he just goes first and he goes turn 2 Dervish, if it starts to grow, it can outpace a lot of the other threats in the format. It definitely bespeaks a paranoia of black. And man, I just wish there were better black cards in the format.
Yeah, and we just haven't seen a ton of black. I mean, certainly people want to play iconic cards like Jusum and whatnot. And Oubliette's a good, you know, removal spell, at least as far as this format goes. But there just doesn't seem to be quite enough tissue there to make mono black work, or even we've seen green black tried a few times, but black is probably the least played color across Four Horsemen, I would say.
Interesting to see that he's got the Whirling Dervishes. I doubt they'd come in the matchup. Similarly, there's no way those active volcanoes are coming in. They just sort of seem like the red elemental blast of Four Horsemen, and that if you're not running them, you just feel silly whenever you play against a blue deck, and you wonder why you didn't run 4 red blasts in your sideboard or similar red blasts. Certainly they don't counter blue spells, but there aren't that many blue spells to interact with on the stack anyway. And the ability to just instant speed, spot permanent destruction, or to do really nasty things like opponent goes second playing an island and you bounce their island back into their hand. That kind of tempo play alone could be enough to win the game. At the very bottom of Peter's sideboard, a second copy of Fissure, which is cool to see, and a second copy of Drop of Honey, which we already discussed at length. So what I wanted to do, though, before we finish up this part of the video is I would like for your guess, if you wanted to be a prophet and figure out exactly who is likely to prevail in this matchup, this best of 3 matchup, Four Horsemen tournament number 17 between Chad and Peter. Who is likely to win? Give me your pick.
I got to root for the underdog, so I'll take Chad.
I'm glad you're willing to throw in your lot with Chad and his scrappy, very, very interesting and intricate design. I am an objectivist foremost, particularly when it comes to Magic, and I also tend to root for the overdog. And so I got to put my vote behind Peter's deck. I think that Peter has too much of an advantage for Chad to overcome in any way that seems realistic to me. I think that if Chad, it's going to really come down to 1 card, in my opinion. I think that Chad can win this matchup if he goes first and he draws Mishra's Workshop. I think that if he draws that 1 card, if he draws Workshop right away, and Peter does not have his 1 Strip Mine or his Fissure on hand right away, I think that Chad could apply enough of a pressure with these big robots, particularly with the Avians, to push through, and that would also allow his Living Plains to really shine. After that, who knows? I think that once they go to the mid game, I just don't know what Chad's strategy is. I just don't know how he's supposed to win the game, because Clockwork Avian doesn't really attack for very much damage. It only does an average of a little bit under 3 damage a turn, depending on when you untap it. And that's not fast enough to even keep up with Dark Heart of the Wood, much less all the other engines in Peter's deck. So I'm going to have to go with a bold prediction. Unfortunately for Chad, founder of the event, and this is, I believe, his first appearance in the finals with the best chance of winning, I think Peter will probably take this match 2-0. But we're about to find out. John and I are about to watch the finals match unfold here. It's, again, going to be a best of 3. So with those predictions done, with the deck techs out of the way, let's get to the games. Are you ready?
Let's do it.